Hi, I'm Joe DiBrigida, and it's my pleasure today to interview my partner, Brad Cook. Brad?
Thank you, Joe. It's nice to be here.
Why don't you start out by telling us where you were born and raised in the early part of your life?
Well, I was born in Glen Ridge, New Jersey, which is 14 miles from New York City. My parents had met at the University of New Hampshire. My mother grew up in Laconia. My father actually grew up in Glen Ridge, New Jersey, but moved to Goshen, New Hampshire during the Depression, graduated from Toll High School in Newport, and went to UNH. And they met, and after World War II, got married and moved back to Glen Ridge, where my father was from. And he worked in New York City. So I grew up there and always summered in New Hampshire, and my grandparents were here and knew that I always felt like I was from New Hampshire, even though I had the decency to live with my parents for the first 18 years. It was kind of practical. And came back as soon as I could to the University of New Hampshire, where I enjoyed myself, got a good education, had some wonderful opportunities like being president of the Young Republicans and president of the student body. Met a lot of people, including lawyers, because I had never met a lawyer before I went to law school. From there, I went to the Cornell Law School. Luckily, I got deferred for 3 years from ROTC, from being commissioned in the Army. The Vietnam War wound down during that period of time when I was in Ithaca. And so I joined the National Guard and started practicing law. In the summer of 1972, I got a summer job at Sheehan, Finney, Bass & Green, having worked in the housing office of the university the year before. And there's a funny story about that, because I worked with Joe Millimet at Devine Millimet, who were university counsel, and he kept saying, apply for a job at our office, and I sent him my resume twice and never heard from him, so I scurried around and met a guy named Kim Zakis and got hired. And the next summer, Mr. Millimet was walking through our office and said, how come you're not working for me? And I said, I sent you 2 resumes, and he said, oh my God, they're still on my desk. Might have been the best favor he ever did me.
So you were summer clerk in the summer of 1972?
In 1972. Coincidentally, I came to work at Sheehan Finney the day that it moved into what was then the Hampshire Plaza, which was the first modern high-rise in New Hampshire. And the firm had spent the weekend moving. It was the Mother's Day weekend. It was the Monday after Mother's Day, 1972. The office building opened. I came to work. First thing that happened was Mr. Finney said, I left my stool back in the Amoskeag building, go across the street and get it. Went back to this place that was totally in shambles, and then came back. And the first week I was there, the firm had, because this office was making a big splash. This was the first move by a law firm into a modern office building. And so people were horrified on what the rent must cost, and it was bringing law practice, at least the office environment, into a new stage. So everybody wanted to see it. And it being 1972, the colors were orange and red and bright and kind of garish by today's standards. But we had 3/4 of the 18th floor in this building. And on the Wednesday and Thursday, we had 2 parties for the bench and bar and for clients and family. And at one of those parties, they taught us how to be tour guides, the young associates and I. And next person in, you took on a tour of the building. And I was next up when this handsome, tall, bald man walked in, and I didn't quite catch his name, but his first name was Frank. And I started around with Frank, and everybody was being very nice to him. And I was Brad, and he was Frank, and we were having a nice time until we got to Mr. Sheehan's office, the northwest corner on the plaza, which ironically is now my office. But we got there, and Frank looked in, and Jack Sheehan said, oh, Mr. Chief Justice. It was Frank Henderson. And I said, oh, shit. And I said, better get out of here. And that was the beginning.
And at that time, you had a job in the library.
I wasn't even hired to be a summer clerk. They said, oh, we have 2 new associates coming in the fall, but somebody has to set up the library. So would you do it? Now, you have to understand, I had 3 job offers that summer. Fred Hall in Rochester, one of my heroes then and now, who'd been the chairman of the board at UNH, offered me $85 a week. And Don Bryant in Dover, who I had met through some university stuff, offered me $100 a week. And Sheehan Finney offered me $125, and I went for the bucks. And I commuted from Durham. But I wasn't hired to be a summer clerk. I was hired to set up the library. So I went to work, and I set up my own, what we whimsically ended up calling the cookie decimal system, and did it in 2 weeks because I wanted to get on to doing the other stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But because I was hired for the library, they never told me anything about billable hours. So I spent the whole summer working on things. And the next year when I got there, they said, well, how much time did you record today? And I said, what are you talking about? So it was a lot of learning involved.
And you have an interesting story about an attorney from Chicago.
Well, I met some fabulous people in the office. I mean, it was the opportunity to work with these giants and meet others outside of Sheehan Finney that were giants. But I got to work with Jack Sheehan, who was 73 years old, or I guess he was 72 years old, which, oh, by the way, I'm going to be in 2 weeks. And Bill Finney, who was in his mid-60s, who'd been Attorney General of the United States under Sherman Adams, not in the United States, of New Hampshire, under Sherman Adams, who became the Chief of Staff in the White House. Mr. Sheehan had been U.S. Attorney. Perkins Bass, who for the first time didn't have an office in the new offices, but practiced in Peterborough,
Mm-hmm.
but had been a congressman. And Bill Green, who built the place. And Mr. Green was 55 or probably 54 years old then. And a very powerful, very intense, obviously wonderfully nice, but also very talented lawyer. And one day he came down the hall to where I was sitting in kind of a secretarial station, paralegal station, and said something strange to me. He said, what kind of automobile do you drive? And I said, well, it's a Rambler American. He said, is it air conditioned? I said, no. And he went back to his office, and he came back about 10 minutes later, and he said, tomorrow morning, you will go over to Merrimack Street Garage, and they will have an automobile for you, and you're to drive to Logan Airport and pick up a lawyer from Chicago who was coming from, I think, Jenner & Block, or one of the big Chicago firms. And he's coming here, and we want to treat him well because he's coming here to the country to represent his client. And so the next morning I got up and I went to Merrimack Street Garage at about 7:30, and they had the most beautiful car I had ever seen. It was an Oldsmobile Toronado with buttons on its buttons and leather on its leather and bells on whistles, and it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. Not a Rambler American with a 3-speed manual transmission on the column. And I took off thinking like I was hot. So-and-so. And I got on the highway at the Amoskeag Circle. The first thing that happened was a state truck went by, kicked up a rock, and broke the windshield. And I said, well, I wonder where I'm working tomorrow. So I drove to Logan. I picked this gentleman up at the United Airlines curb, and he was Mr. Personality coming back. Oh, you go to Cornell, that's really nice. You ought to come out and see us in Chicago. We'll show you how law is practiced, blah, blah, blah. And, you know, he was just Mr. Confidence. So I bring him back. He goes up the elevator. He goes into the northeast corner office. And about 10 minutes later, the walls start to go boom, 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 boom. Mr. Green was rearranging his anatomy. And that went on for a while. And several of the lawyers who were nearby, and they weren't wimps, Jim Higgins and John Richardson and Alan Reich, all come out of their office, go to the library, because they don't want something was going on. This guy was getting the Green treatment. And about 1:30, Mr. Green came down to my desk and said, Mr. Smith is ready to go back to Boston if you bring the car around. So I did. Man got in the car, reclined his seat, looked at the rear view mirror, looked at the mirror or visor all the way to Boston. And when I got there, he said, I only have 2 things to say to you, young man. You're in a good place, and go to work for that man. Because he had come to Manchester to tell Mr. Green that his client, who owed Mr. Green's client $1 million and had no reason not to pay it, just didn't want to. And the check came the next day. And what's ironic about that is 30 years later, when Mr. Green was in his 80s, and the young associates would come around and say, he's such a nice old man, I'd say, you have no clue.
That's right. Tell us about the bar exam.
Well, at the end of the summer, of the summer clerk summer, I applied for the bar exam before I went back to Ithaca. And unbeknownst to me, they assigned you a number, because bar exams are graded anonymously. They assigned you a number based on when you applied, and I was the first one to apply, apparently. So the next year, when it came time for the bar exam, and we'll talk about studying for it in a minute, but I get the number, and it's 0001, and I said, this is either a very good sign or a very bad sign, because I've got a mark on my head. 4 lawyers from the McLean law firm, and by the way, she Finney was tied for the biggest law firm in New Hampshire in 1972 with 12 lawyers. McLean had 12. Devine Millimet had 10. Orrin Reno had 7. And these were the big firms. But 4 of the lawyers from the McLean firm taught a bar review course at St. Anselm College every night after work. And you'd study and you'd learn, and then you'd go play Frisbee on the lawn, look down at the city of Manchester. Well, the 3 of us from Cornell who were taking the bar exam that summer were Jim Townsend, who was going to work at Devine Millimet, but they were assembling the bar exam, so he couldn't study there. And Dick Webush, who was going to go work at the Attorney General's office for Attorney General Rudman. And they had no space for him to study. So the 3 of us studied in the library with the then 1973 summer clerk, Claudia Damon, who I'm about to interview after this interview is over for another one of these histories. And she was very good to us, but we studied and we studied and we studied, and it's a horrifying experience, as everybody knows. And you think your life's passing in front of you, and then you go to take the bar exam, and it was given in the Supreme Court library. And the Supreme Court library had 2-person tables, and they put you at them alphabetically. So I was sitting there with a fellow that I'd gone to UNH with, Arthur Connolly, who unfortunately has since passed away, whose father was a client of Mr. Sheehan's. And at about the 3rd question of the multi-state, and this was the 2nd year of the multi-state bar exam, Arthur lets out this wonderful groan like, oh, and I said, Arthur, just shut up. I don't want, don't want to hear anything else. So, of course, we made a mistake. We went out after the first quarter, or the half of the morning, and you never should say anything about what you just had on the test. But one of us said to the other 2, what did you put for the last answer? And one said A, one said B, and one said C, and we didn't talk about anything else. And that day got over, and you wondered what you were going to do with the rest of your life. I contemplated getting in a car and driving to California.
Because you weren't going to be a lawyer.
Because you weren't going to be a lawyer. And then you went back the next day and you took the essay part. Now, Dick Webush is a very focused guy. And he got focused during our study period on a common law bankruptcy case from about 1885 from New Hampshire. And Jim and I were all over him like a rug saying, get off of this thing, you're being a nut. It's crazy. But it was drilled into us. And the next to last question on the bar exam was that case. And we all knew it by name. And we came out and he said, I told you guys. But somehow we passed. And I went off to the Army 2 weeks later. Actually, I went to Princeton, New Jersey to Claudia Damon's wedding. And then I drove to Indianapolis, Indiana for officer basic training. And I had left instructions with my secretary that if a letter came from Devine Millimet, give it to Mr. Higgins and have him call me. But she didn't. So I came home from the Army one day, and I opened my mail, and there's a letter from Devine Millimet. And I said, oh, goodness. So I opened it, and the first line was, Dear Mr. Cook, we are pleased. I didn't read anything else. They could have said, we're pleased there won't be too many more lawyers in New Hampshire, but that's not what it said. And I went out and took my roommates out to a bar and bought a new suit and woke up on Monday. And came back for the swearing in, and then came back to work in beginning of November.
What was the process like back then whereby you got an offer from the firm for full-time?
Well, after the summer, I was pretty sure that I was going to get an offer. But I went back to Cornell and I interviewed anyway, just in case. And in those days at Cornell, the firms had to take whoever signed up. This was the age of equality or something. and you didn't have any class rank and all this stuff. So I signed up for a bunch of New York firms, including Sullivan and Cromwell, which was Cornell's lawyers. Now, most of the law students at Cornell want to work in New York City because they come from the metropolitan area. So I get invited back to Sullivan and Cromwell, and they flew me down. In those days, you interviewed Thanksgiving weekend, so they flew me home for Thanksgiving. So that was a good deal. On Mohawk Airlines, which wasn't a good deal. And I went over, and I genuflected in front of John Foster Dulles' picture, and I was kind of loose because I didn't really think I wanted to work there. My father commuted to New York his whole life, and I didn't think I wanted to do that. And lo and behold, I get an offer. And I got the privilege for 30 grand, which was huge. And I wrote him back and said I had a better offer after I got my offer from Sheehan Finney. And I got that offer Election Day weekend in 1972, which was when President Nixon was running for re-election. And I came back from Cornell to vote and do things. And I went to the UNH football game and sat with Dick Morse, who was our managing partner, but also the chairman of the board at the university, or at least on the board. And Walter Peterson, the governor of New Hampshire, was sitting right behind me. And after half the game was over, during the third quarter, Dick had gone out to a tailgate party, thank God, and he came back, he said, oh, by the way, we voted to hire you. And he said, will you take it? I said, well, I'll have to think about it. And I thought about it for about 4 seconds, and I said, I accept. And Governor Peterson taps me on the shoulder, and he says, ask him what you're going to make. I said, oh, what am I going to make? He said, I don't know, whatever they made last year. And I said, well, I'll take it. And Peterson starts to laugh. He said, well, you guys are great negotiators. So,
Probably wasn't $30,000 though.
it was $12,500, and I got a $500 bonus, and I'd never seen that much money in my life.
But still a better offer.
And bought my mother a color television set for the first time in her life.
What was the nature of the bar back in 1973?
Well,
when you
our
started?
class took the number of members of the bar, over 900 and 1,000. And it was horrifying to people because there were 125 people who passed the bar in 1973. And people thought the world had gone to hell in a handbasket because it was getting so big. And now and we didn't have bar numbers at the time. Now everybody's got a number. Numbers weren't assigned until the 1990s or early 2000s. And of course, when they were assigned alphabetically. So Kim Zakis was always really ticked off at me that he, who had passed the bar in 1955 or 6, had number 1,400 or something, and I had 489. He just thought that was a terrible injustice. But the bar was almost all men. It was very collegial. Everybody knew each other, at least in towns. Because it was almost all male, everybody was referred to as brother this or brother that. That went away when women became a significant part of the bar, and today there are more women than men passing the bar. Everybody did everything. We didn't have hyphenated lawyers, as I call them. We had lawyers. I could form a corporation in the morning and take a deposition in the afternoon and write a will in the late afternoon. Mr. Sheehan, Claudia reminded me of this the other day. Mr. Sheehan used to call me the all-round athlete because he said you could do anything. But Mr. Finney would take you to things. He'd say, come on, we're going to meet a client. And the client would explain his problem, and he'd say, well, I want you to meet Mr. Cook. So he's our fill-in-the-blank expert, because whatever it was. And I'd say to him on the way back, Mr. Finney, I don't know anything about that. And he said, you will. And you did.
Yeah.
And we weren't anywhere nearly as sophisticated or knowledgeable in depth as lawyers have become today. But I think it's more fun, but then Mr. Sheehan used to say it was more fun in 1923 when he started. So you probably always kind of look back and say it was more fun that way.
It's always better in hindsight.
And we did everything. I mean, I came back, and Dick Morse said, you're going up to Canterbury Shaker Village. I don't know where Canterbury was. I didn't know what Shaker Village was. But the Shakers in Canterbury had been a long-time client of the firm because Mr. Sheehan, who represented Commercial Union Insurance Company, had been called in 1950 or so that one of the Shakers had had a car accident and was insured by Commercial Union. And he either settled it or tried it or whatever it was, but it was resolved. And after it was resolved, the Eldredges said to him, we need a lawyer. Would you represent us? Now, Mr. Sheehan was a titan of the Catholic laity in Manchester.
Mm-hmm.
So the Shakers from then on called him Father Sheehan. And the Shakers had begun to die off. They weren't replenishing their membership. So then when Dick Morse came to work in the firm in the 1950s, Jack, who was a trial lawyer, said to him, "Here, take care of these people because you might know what they're doing."
Mm-hmm.
And Dick really established quite a relationship with him, incorporated the Shaker Village, and it was just about to be a museum, nonprofit 501c3 museum in 1973. So for the beginning of November, 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, I went to Shaker Village every day and inventoried the collection with a guy named Bud Thompson, who's now about 99 years old. And it was very scientific. I had a yellow pad, and it was one Shaker box, one Shaker spoon, one Shaker table, one Shaker, chair. But we got through it. And at lunch, we'd go in, and every day was Thanksgiving, because you'd go into this room from the cold outside. It was like 25 degrees. And the eldresses, 3 of them or 4 of them were still alive. And you'd have a roast pork or a roast beef or a roast turkey with pies, and everything was warm.
Mm-hmm.
And they loved having young people around.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just wonderful. And now, 46 years later, none of them are around. And I'm on the Shaker, but I treasure those memories, because it's not what you don't learn any of this stuff in law school. In fact, you found out, we all find out, you hardly learn anything in law school that you do when you get out of law school. But you know something about law, which is a good thing.
You mentioned earlier taking depositions. Tell us about your early trial work.
Well, along about that same time that I was doing the Shaker thing several days a week, Tom Richards, who was one of our partners, I thought everybody was older because everybody was older, but they weren't very old, came into me and said, "Tomorrow you're going down to Plaistow District Court and try a case," or maybe it was Salem, I don't know. And I said, "I'm going to what?" And he said, "Yeah, you're going to defend a car accident case." I said, "Well, who's my client?" And they said, "Oh, he won't be there. Your client's a commercial union insurance company. You can't lose this case." I said, "What do you mean I can't lose this case?" He said, "You can't lose this case because the demand in the case is way over the value of the case, and the judge will know what the case is worth. They want $1,200, and we've offered them $400, and you can't lose." So off I go to the whichever district court it was, and I get there and I realize I don't know what table to sit at. And I asked Tom before I left, I said, "What table do I sit at?" He said, "Whichever one the other guy doesn't sit at, you sit at." And I said, "Well, it follows, okay." And it was Paul Kafori, who was a young lawyer, and he was very nice to me. And he came in and he put on his show, and Paul's kind of a showman, and he put on his show and he put his client on, and he talked about all the damages and how badly he was hurt. And I asked a few questions, and we put in the damage report, and the medical bills were like $25, and the collision repairs were like $200. And the judge went out, and we chatted for a while, and he came back and said, $550. And I went home dejected because I'd lost the case.
Mm-hmm.
And Tom said, "I told you you were going to win this case." And he called Arthur Leary, who was the adjuster for commercial union for 100 years, Jack Sheehan's best friend. And he was delighted because we'd saved him $700. And then we went and we did all kinds of other cases. But several years later, in a much more interesting case with a very good trial lawyer in our office named Joe Devan, I was on a 6-week case over in Exeter called Faust versus Leighton Chevrolet. And it was 6 weeks of trial with 5 law firms, or 6. The car in question was a Corvair, although it had nothing to do with being a Corvair case. But that's the car that Ralph Nader had made famous with unsafe at any speed. So General Motors was scared. They'd sent a lawyer from Detroit, who was a Corvair case specialist, to try it. Matthias Reynolds from Divine Millimet was on the other side. At the very time that we were trying this case, I was making an offer and seeing if I was buying a house right across the street from Matt Reynolds' house. So he was very nice to me about that. Joe was the primary lawyer. We represented Leighton Chevrolet, which had sold the car.
Mhm.
So the defendants were General Motors, Leighton Chevrolet, Uniroyal or General Tire or whoever made the tires, and Rudy's Tires in Portsmouth, which had sold the tires. And the Wadley firm represented the tire manufacturer, Phil Peters, who was in Bob Chiesa, who were good lawyers. And then Rudy's Tires was represented by Judge Flynn and Mr. McGurk from Portsmouth, who were characters, to say the least. Well, what had happened was, and the plaintiff, and Burns, Bryant, Hitchie, Cox, and Shea were the plaintiffs, and the plaintiff was an African-American young girl who had graduated from Portsmouth High School with two of her friends, and a lot of her friends, but she and two of her friends had met up at a bar on Route 1 near the turnoff to Wentworth by the Sea, and had several drinks and gotten in the car, and they were driving back to Portsmouth, and they were going around a curve right by the cemetery coming into town. When the car went over too far to the right, tire went off, snow curb, went off and went down a couple of inches. The driver, somewhat impaired, thought that she'd had a blowout, oversteered the car, went across the road, hit a stone wall, and the unfortunate young lady who was the plaintiff was in the middle without a seatbelt on, went through the windshield, became a paraplegic. So it was a terrible case. So they sued on the theory that the brakes had failed and that the tires were defective, because when they did an examination of the wreck, the tire was blown out and the brake lining ultimately was perforated. Well, they'd been sitting in a barn for a year and a half in the moisture before they did the test. Case went on for 6 weeks. It was Judge Charles G. Douglas III's first Superior Court trial after being appointed. He hadn't been to judge's school yet. Everybody got up to do the final arguments. They went on for hours. Scientific, the experts, yak, yak, yak. Joe DeVan got up and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, you're good Americans. You know what happened here. 3 girls went out drinking. They're friends. This is a terrible accident. Wasn't the brakes, wasn't the tires. Went over the edge, went down several inches, oversteer. It's not the tires. It's the driver. We're really sorry this girl was hurt, but it's not these defendants." Flynn and McGurk had settled out their part of the case before they put it on for $50,000 because they didn't have any witnesses. Their witness list was their expert was a bartender from center of Portsmouth to say what happens when you have 3 drinks, and the judge Douglas wouldn't allow it. Jury goes out. 3 days go by. Matt Reynolds and I played a lot of cards. Joe stayed at the office. Jury comes back, all defendants' verdicts. Judge Douglas is horrified, having been a plaintiff's lawyer and having tried to get the parties to settle, and there was a lot of money on the table to settle. He called everybody into chambers, and he said, "I'm thinking of overturning these verdicts as against the weight of the evidence." And he turned to me. Now, Judge Douglas and I were 2/3 of the JAG Corps of the Army National Guard at the time, along with Bob Bastard. That was on weekends. He said, "And if I do that, what do you think?" And I said, "Judge, if you do that, you don't understand 700 years of Anglo-Saxon jurisprudence." And he looked at me and he said, "Do you want to rephrase that?" I said, "No, I don't." And he said, "I could hold you in contempt." I said, "But you won't." And he didn't. He did overturn the verdicts. And by the time I got to the Supreme Court, he was on the Supreme Court, obviously not sitting on the case. And they overturned it and restored the verdicts. And that was the longest trial I was ever in. After that, I actually tried 3 jury trials to conclusion. But when you were doing everything, and by now it's 1979, let's say, you have to pick one. And I was doing a lot of corporate and not-for-profit work, and I really liked the not-for-profit stuff, so I stopped doing the trial stuff. But there's nothing as fun or as terrifying as telling the story to the jury, and litigation's wonderful about 2% of the time, and it's horrible about 98% of the time. So,
Did you want to touch on Smith versus Manchester Management?
the last case I was involved in while I was waiting to see if I was going to become a partner. So it was the fall of 1977. We became partners in those days in 3.5 years, which has been extended somewhat, if you became a partner. Was a case called Smith versus Manchester Management. Bill Smith is an auctioneer in Plainfield, New Hampshire, then and now. In fact, he has a very sophisticated Plainfield auction gallery up there that's very nice. Well, he and a client of ours, Nick Bolus, who ran Medical Arts Apothecary on Elm Street, had invested in the barns of Bedford, which are right next to what was C.R. Sparks or where the Lexus dealer is, to make it an antique gallery. And they'd been financed and encouraged by a subsidiary of Bank East, which was called Manchester Management, which had been formed to help develop the Eastman development in Grantham, but then had branched out. And there were all kinds of business claims on why they were induced to get involved in this thing and why it didn't work, and when it failed, they sued Manchester Management. Well, Jim Higgins was the lawyer on this case, and Mr. Higgins is a very intense, very fine trial lawyer in our office, but he was a terrorist when it came to associates. And it was like, where's this exhibit, where's this exhibit, where's this? It was terror. 6 weeks in front of a master. Jack Middleton was on the other side, one of the best lawyers ever, and several lawyers from the McLean firm. And Charlie Connis, who was Kim Zakis' cousin, no, not Charlie Connis, George Manius, who was Kim Zakis' cousin, was the master, later a Superior Court judge. And we took a break for Thanksgiving, and I remember driving home, saying to my wife as we were driving to New Jersey with the little kids in the back, one little kid in the back, I don't care if I become a partner or not, get me out of this trial, please, because it was terror. And we ultimately prevailed with some kind of money, but it wasn't as much as we wanted. But it was quite a trial, and it was memorable. And you learn a lot from Jim Higgins.
So you moved on from trial work to nonprofits.
And corporate. And then ultimately estate planning, but not so much of that at the time. Yeah, the nonprofit work kind of evolved. One of the other things that happened in the summer of '72 was Kim Zakis, who was one of the great lawyers and great people in my life and kind of my mentor, said to me one day, you're going to go up to New Hampshire College and blah, 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 blah. And I said, what the heck's New Hampshire College? It was this little place on North River Road. And I was going up to see the Vice President for Student Affairs, George Larkin, because having been president of the student body at UNH, they thought I knew something about student affairs, and I was supposed to bring this little business school some advice, which had nothing to do with law. I never heard of New Hampshire College. I never heard of North River Road either. So I went up North River Road, past the Youth Development Center, right down the hill from where I live now, and went to there. And now it's Southern New Hampshire University, and we represented them all through the development. I went on the board in '78 or '9, was on it for 30 years, was secretary of the board, helped change the name to Southern New Hampshire University, helped hire Paul LeBlanc, who's the president now, watched Dick Gustafson and different people. It's the largest university in the world in enrollment, and it was kind of fun to watch. But in the process, you'll learn a lot about nonprofits, and when you learn about one, you learn about another one. Dartmouth College gave us a lot of work. The University Foundation I helped form with Dick Morse, small not-for-profits. I was president of the Alumni Association at UNH in 1978, which was ridiculously young for somebody to do that, but I was, because everybody, baby boomers were everything in those days, as they still think they are. And after I was done, a good friend of ours, our insurance guy, and a client named Ray Tronsolito, who's a good friend of yours too, came to me and said, you're not on the UNH alumni board anymore. How would you like to be on another board? And I said, sure, what? He said, Easter Seals. I said, what the heck's Easter Seals? And got introduced to Easter Seals New Hampshire and went on that board, and then ultimately we became their counsel, and now it's one of our biggest clients, and it's been, Easter Seals in 7 states and the largest Easter Seals in the world, and a great opportunity to meet wonderful people. At Southern New Hampshire University, then New Hampshire College, Ed Shapiro was the president, and along about 1986, one week I got 25 phone calls from people at the college saying it was hemorrhaging. There was trouble. Now, my office was here on the 18th floor. Kimmons was here. Bill Green's was here. Bill Green had been chairman of the board of New Hampshire College because he'd saved it in 1952 when the founder died and was chairman of the board. Kimmon was secretary of the board, and I was doing the work. So I called them together, and I said, something's going on up at the college. There's trouble. And Kimmon, never being a man of weak opinion, said, well, you'll have to go up there and be president. I said, I was 36 years old or whatever. I said, I don't think so. I said, let's get together tomorrow and figure out what's going on. So I went home, and I thought, you know, Bill Green's kind of the guru of this place. And he was then 69, 68 years old. And I came in the next day, I said, you know, Bill should be president. Bill said, that's ridiculous. And they thought about it, and he said, no, I can do that. So we got the trustees together, explained to them what the problem was. Meanwhile, I had done a little research and found out that we had financial problems and all kinds of other problems. And we had a trustee meeting, and they made Bill Green the chancellor, which was a new title that nobody had ever had at New Hampshire College. Eddie was the president without portfolio for special projects. And right after the meeting, and everybody knew something was up, a reporter from the union leader called me and said, what's going on? Is Eddie Shapiro being fired? And with a straight face, I said, no, he has a new assignment, blah, 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 blah. And that wasn't even credible to me. And she bought it. And so it never looked like there was a problem. And then Bill spent 2 years as chancellor really putting it together, firing a lot of people, reorganizing things. I had to renegotiate the contract with the faculty. And one day, this was you'd rather be lucky than good, which is always true. The treasurer, vice president treasurer of the college said to me, the auditors are looking at the renegotiated contract, and because it deferred some pension obligations which aren't important. But he said, if that's a current obligation on the balance sheet, we're going to not make our bond covenants, and we're going to be down the chutes. And I said to John Miles, the treasurer, without knowing anything about what I was talking about, tell them to put it in a footnote, because I'd seen a lot of things in footnotes. And the auditors bought it, and Bill Green was in New York that weekend. And he came back, and I called him. I said, I got to come see you, because he knew what the problem was. And I went in and told him the story, and he hugged me. And I said, man, I don't know anything about accounting, but I'm glad I've read some audits.
And within the nonprofit world, you represented some religious institutions.
Yes. The most prominent of which is the Roman Catholic Bishop of Manchester. In about the same period of time, the mid-'80s, there was a case over in Hampton called the Hampton Nuns case, where the pastor of the Hampton Catholic Church, which had an elementary school, discharged several nuns who were teaching there. And the misfortune for the church was one of them was the aunt of Jim Finnegan, who was the editorial writer at the Union Leader. And every day there was an editorial, why were the nuns fired? Why were the nuns fired? And they hired a lawyer, and they went to court, and the judge threw out the case because it was an internal church matter, and they appealed it to the Supreme Court. On the basis that they had civil contracts, which they did, which was a mistake, because the way the church is supposed to work is the diocese is supposed to contract with the order, which is supposed to supply the nuns, but these 4 nuns had the same contract that other teachers had. And on the basis of that, the Supreme Court said, we have jurisdiction to interpret the contracts. And the case settled. But in the process, the Bishop Gendron and his staff decided we better hire a law firm, because they'd always had volunteer counsel. Good Catholic volunteers had volunteered their time, and at this particular time it was Burns, Bryan, Hinchy, Cox, and Shea, because Stanley Burns was a long-time, very religious, devout Catholic layman. So it came down to us and Divine Melamed, and we win, and we're being invited up to the bishop's house on North River Road for the final interview. Now, I'd had nothing to do with it, because I'm not Catholic. And Mr. Sheehan, who'd been going to Mass since 1899, and Joe DeVan, who was a devout Catholic, and Bob Daston, and Dan Gregoire, and all these good Catholic people, none of whom knew anything about nonprofit law, said, we better find somebody who knows something about nonprofit law. So Mr. Sheehan came down to my office, and he said, we're going up to the bishop's house, and I didn't know anything about bishops. I was raised Baptist and married a Catholic, and we became Lutherans. What did I know about bishops? So he said, we're going up to the bishop's house. We'd like you to come, but how are we going to explain you? He said, I know. The Archbishop of New York was Cardinal Cook, with an E. He said, well, tell him you're Cardinal Cook's nephew. I said, Jack, why don't we tell him I'm Cardinal Cook's son? Oh, no, he said, we can't do that. So up we went, and it was Bishop Gendron and his assistant bishop, or the auxiliary bishop, Mulvey, who later became the Bishop of Wilmington and then Providence, and Monsignor Quinn, and Monsignor Christian, later Bishop Christian, and wonderful people. Monsignor Mullen, who was the man who worked with the legal stuff. And we went through the whole thing, and the bishop said, well, you're hired. And we went out on the front stoop, Dan Gregoire and I and Bishop Mulvey. And it was a beautiful sunny day, and we're looking over Stark Park. And Bishop Mulvey says, well, Brad, what parish do you live in? And I said, St. Catherine's. He didn't say go to. He said, oh, good, you're nearby. And I said, yes. So 4 or 5 weeks later, I get a call from Monsignor Mullen, who's been calling every day. And I've been doing all this stuff. Nobody else had been getting a call. And he said, Bradford, which is the way he talked. He said, Bradford, I was talking to my cousin Richard. Dick Mullen is a lawyer in Concord. He was John Mullen's cousin. And he tells me that you're not one of us. And I said, well, I've been wondering about that, Monsignor. We had Jack Sheehan, the Irish Catholic, and Joe DeVan, and Bob Daston, Dan Gregoire, the young Franco-American Catholic guy, and Cook, the Protestant, and you've only been calling Cook. What's the story? He said, well, it's very simple to explain. There were no Jews present. And we had a wonderful time and represented the church. And I have to say that people I worked with in the diocese, and you did a lot of this work too, but the people we worked with in the diocese were the smartest group of people I've ever dealt with. And the beauty of institutional representation is that you get to know your clients really well, but the nature of the business is as varied as everything else you do. But every time somebody calls you new, you kind of have to get them pre-qualified as some kind of a crank, and you know they're not cranks. And we had some serious business. And of course, the sex abuse scandal, which affected the Diocese of Manchester like affected everywhere else, changed the nature of legal representation for the church, because they had to hire 5 or 6 law firms to do different things, and then ultimately hired in-house counsel. But it was the most interesting experience, and you can't say what happened in client relationships, but a lot of the things people read weren't true.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about your relationship with Warren Rudman and his run for office?
Well, Senator Rudman, who Rudman Center is right down the hall here, but Warren Rudman was the Attorney General of New Hampshire. And I had met him in 1969 at Governor Peterson's office when I was president of the student body at UNH. And before that, having been the president of the Young Republicans, in the year that Walter Peterson was elected governor, we'd all become pretty good friends. In 1969, I went up to the governor's office to represent the university one day with some other students. And Warren Rudman was a young lawyer from Nashua. He was in his late 30s. He was counsel to the governor. He wasn't yet attorney general. And he was always late. Drove fast, came in late. We were in with the governor, and Warren comes to the outer office, and this is 1969. There are a lot of student radicals in the world, of which I was not one. And he comes in to the receptionist in the outer office at the governor's office, and he says, "Who's in there with the governor?" And they say, students from the university. And he thinks, oh my God, it's these radicals are in there. And he comes charging in the back door of the governor's office while we're in the mid-sentence and says, I know about you people. I was on the debate team and the boxing team at Syracuse. And I looked up, having never seen this man before, and I said, I don't know who you are, sir, but if you don't know what you're talking about, why don't you be quiet? And Walter started to laugh. So that was my introduction to Warren Rudman. 6 years later, he was appointed by President Ford as the chairman of the Interstate Commerce Commission. And the then Senator Durkin blocked it because the Democrats thought they could elect a president and then they'd get to appoint a head. And because Warren was an impatient guy, he said, to heck with this, I'm not doing this. And he called Bill Green, who was one of his heroes, because Bill had represented his father's company in Nashua before Warren went to law school. And Warren always said he went to law school because of Bill's example. And he said, can I come to work for Sinn Féin? And they said, sure. And they told me that he was coming. This is 76, I'm not yet a partner. And I said, well, this will be interesting. They said, yes, it will, because Warren's a very intense, very smart, very confident, active guy. And he came and was very helpful. We got to be very good friends. And he was very helpful as a mentor. And I remember we were walking, and he gave me hints on who to talk to about, you know, you're doing okay, you're going to be a partner, but talk to this person about this and this and this. So I get voted in, and it's going to be my first partnership meeting. And we're walking down the hall to the meeting, and Mr. Rudman puts his hand on my shoulder, and he said, you know, Brad, it's not written anywhere you have to talk at these meetings. And I've given that advice to other new partners, and it was very good advice. And in 1980, in January, he came down the hall one day, and he said, I'm running for the United States Senate. Do you want to help? And I said, yeah. He said, okay, we're going to Plymouth in 2 minutes. So we took off for Plymouth, and we started the campaign, and I was his first campaign manager. And if I had been his last campaign manager, he'd still be practicing law. But we ultimately hired people, and it was a great, fun experience. Another time he came out into the hall, soon after getting there, though, at the top of his voice, he said, does anybody here know anything about public employment law? Because there was a board had been formed by the legislature called the Public Employee Labor Relations Board, because the Public Employee Labor Relations Act had been passed allowing public employees to unionize. And the Manchester teachers had gone on strike. And the board was still represented by the Attorney General's office, although there was a provision in the statute that they could hire its own counsel. David Hackett Souter was the Attorney General of New Hampshire after Warren, and he called his former boss and said, will you guys represent the board? I'd done my senior project at Cornell on public employment law. So I said to Warren, yeah, I have. I'd like to do it. And off we went. 3 days later, we settled the strike and then started representing the board and got to go to the Supreme Court 6 or 7 times. And so one time I go to the Supreme Court after the first case we went on was the Rochester teachers case. In the Rochester teachers case, there'd been an unfair labor practice finding against John Shaw, the mayor of Rochester, who ignored the board and wouldn't honor a teacher contract that had been negotiated. And Jack Middleton represented the New Hampshire Education Association. And I represented the board. Bobby Fisher from Dover represented the mayor and had gone to the executive council to get the board impeached and removed, and had done all this stuff. So we're there. Retired General Edward J. Hazeltine was chairman of the board. And I remember my opening argument before the court, which was, there's a city in New Hampshire that doesn't know it's in New Hampshire. But the ironic one was, after the court several years later said, okay, the board can't come anymore because it's an administrative agency. When there's an appeal from it, we'll consider it, because they'd let us come to educate them on the law, but they said we don't need it anymore, unless the board feels it's really important. So there was a little case up in Conway, New Hampshire, on how many members it took to be in a unit under the Public Employee Labor Relations Act, a very arcane question. But the union didn't want to spend the money to go to the Supreme Court, and the town appealed the board's decision. So the board said, we want you to go. So I made a motion to the court. Ralph Wood was then the clerk of court. It was unanimously granted, and I show up on the appointed day and get up in front of the court. I think Brock was probably the Chief Justice. It might have been Grimes. Souter's there. Douglas is there, I think. I get up and I say, "May it please the court." And the Chief Justice says, "Mr. Cook, why are you here?" I said, "Well, Your Honor, I made a motion. You grant it." They huddle, bring Wood over. "Okay, proceed." Second question, so I say, "May it please the court?" And Justice Souter says, "Mr. Cook, can you read?" "Why are you here? Can you read?" I said, "Well, I believe so, Your Honor." He said, "Well, read the statute to me." Well, the statute didn't say what we said it said, because we were trying to say what it meant to have it all make sense, but it didn't say it. And I said, "But, Your Honor," and he said, "Don't give me the Hartford Trinity Church case." Now, there's a Hartford Trinity Church case in the federal courts where in a footnote, the judge said, "The law doesn't always mean what it says." He said, "I don't want to hear the Hartford Trinity case." So I mumbled for 10 or 15 minutes and sat down, and General Hazeltine was there, and we were walking out. He said, "I guess we better go to the legislature and get the law changed, because we're not winning here." And we didn't, and we did. So Warren goes to the Senate for 12 years, comes back of counsel to us as well as to Paul Weiss in New York, sent a lot of very important cases to us, like the Tyco multi-district class action litigation. Mm-hmm. And, you know, Bill Green, Kim Zakas, Warren Rudman, Bill Finney, watching those people practice law and learning from them is it's an experience that transcends the generations of lawyers, and it's just an opportunity like you're never going to see in your life.
Mm-hmm. And you were a part of that too. I mean, you had a few years there managing the firm and keeping it as the place that it is.
Well, Dick Morse got sick. First of all, Dick Morse had been managing partner for about 33 years. And he realized that the firm had grown to 70 lawyers. And Dick said, "We got to have a process. We've got to have a governance process and an organizational process that's not like it always was." And we set up a strategic planning committee that met for a year, and I was chairman of it. And it came up with a new structure with terms for the managing partner and a management committee and real formality that we didn't have before. And then when that was done, he said, "Would you like to be the first one?" And I said, "Well, I'll do it. None of us go to business school. You did it later, so you know about this. We don't go to business school. We go to law school." We had a very good administrator. I said, "Sure." Did it for 8 years. And frankly, you do it because you like the people you're doing it for. Mm-hmm. You don't do it because it was your lifelong ambition to
manage a bunch of lawyers.
To be the lowest form of life. But yes, I did that for a long period of time. And it was very, very rewarding. But let me tell you about another set of cases that we had that were kind of important and are kind of important in history, and those are the union, what I call the union leader cases. Mm-hmm. One day as a young lawyer, I was sitting in my office, and Mr. Sheehan came down the hall, and he said, "I want you to go downstairs to a conference room and meet your new client, Mr. Mahoney." I know anything about Mr. Mahoney? Well, there was a lawyer in Manchester named Jim Winston, who was a long-time single practitioner who had usually one associate, but he basically was a one-man show. And he had a young associate who had gone to the Lamplighter bar over on the corner of 114, proceeded to get himself fairly oiled, went out and killed himself in a car crash, which was terrible. He was the only other lawyer in Mr. Winston's office. So Winston said, "I can't handle all these cases." And one of them was a workers' compensation case for this man named Raymond Mahoney, who was a pressman at the Union Leader and who had been injured and had this workers' compensation case. Well, Winston called him up and said, "You'll have to come get your file and take it to another lawyer. I can't do it." Ray Mahoney's father's lawyer had been Jack Sheehan. It's the only lawyer he knew. So he comes to see Mr. Sheehan, who said, here, you're now a workers' compensation lawyer, which I knew nothing about. So in the process of talking to Ray Mahoney, who was this big guy, 60 years old, worked for the union leader for 35 years. I said, you've worked there for 35 years? I keep reading about this union leader profit sharing plan and trust that's going to own the paper, because Loeb wrote it. Mr. Loeb was the publisher. William Loeb was a famous character and right-wing guy, one of the most powerful people in New Hampshire. And he kept writing about how he was going to give the paper to the employees by giving it to this profit-sharing plan. So I said to Ray, you must have a pretty good account in that profit-sharing plan and trust. You've been there 35 years. He said, yeah, I think it's worth about $3,000. I said, you mean $30,000? He said, no. I said, well, we'll find out about this. So I wrote a letter to the union leader, not anti-union leader, not anything, just asking, what are Mr. Mahoney's benefits, what are his accounts, and what's his account at the union leader profit-sharing plan and trust. Well, the day the letter got to the union leader, I got a call from Ralph Warren Sullivan, his name was, who was counsel to Mr. Loeb, who said, you're not like those other lawyers over there, Brad, who don't like the union leader, and you can't have this information because he's not a participant. He doesn't work there anymore. Well, we had a new lawyer who I knew pretty well, Alan Cleveland, who was doing our ERISA work, because thank God he was younger and less experienced than I was when the ERISA came along, and I got to say, let Alan do it. And I went to Alan and I said, I'm pretty sure Mahoney's a participant. He has an account, and they won't give me the information. He said, oh, there's a provision in ERISA that says if they won't give you the information, it's a $10,000 fine. And I laughed and said, you get me $10,000, I'll take you to lunch. So they started the case. Alan started looking, I was doing the workers' comp case. They start looking at this case, and they realized that what Mr. Loeb had been doing was the following. Mr. Loeb was president of the Union Leader Corporation and chairman of the board of trustees, board of directors. Mr. Loeb was chairman of the profit sharing plan and trust trustees, and Mr. Loeb was the sole shareholder of the paper. The paper was making money. When the paper made money, he'd get the board of directors to vote to use the money to buy stock in the union leader. That way, they didn't have to pay taxes on it. Mr. Loeb, as the owner of the stock, would sell it. No, they'd vote to contribute it to the profit sharing plan, so it wouldn't be taxed. Mr. Loeb, as chairman of the profit sharing plan, would get the trustees to vote to buy stock, and the union leader, Mr. Loeb, as owner of the paper, owner of the stock, would sell the stock. So he could take it at capital gains rates and not dividend rates. And there was an unlimited supply of stock. So he got the profits at less taxes than he otherwise would have. The problem with this was it was against the law in ERISA. Now the irony was he had another pension plan for people that was taking care of their retirement. But this was an ERISA qualified plan. So Bill Green, who had had a running battle with Mr. Loeb since the 50s for a number of reasons, and Mike Harvell, one of our trial lawyers, took this case with Alan Cleveland, and they took it to federal court. By the time they were done, Mr. Loeb had to sell a third of the union leader to a shipping magnate from up in Ogdensburg, New York, for a lot of money, who had borrowed the money from Jimmy Hoffa at the Teamsters, who was in the Lewisburg Penitentiary. And on Jimmy Hoffa's birthday every year, Mr. Loeb had an airplane go by, happy birthday, Jimmy Hoffa, go over the... So that was one of the union leader cases. The other one was, we all got to know an author who had been a former union leader reporter named Kevin Cash. And Kevin Cash was writing a book about Mr. Loeb called Who the Hell is William Loeb? And Alan Cleveland and I helped him do some of the work and come up with the book. And then, when the book was published, self-published, he formed a company called Amescape Press. I think we formed it for him. And he published the book. Mr. Loeb did everything he could not to have this book published and was very irritated by this book. And he wrote in an editorial that the book was a pack of lies and had defamed him. Now, if you're an author and somebody says you're a liar and you've defamed somebody, you've been defamed. And we knew Loeb was going to sue Cash. Loeb was a citizen of Reno, Nevada, not of pride's costing Massachusetts, and certainly not of New Hampshire. We knew if he sued us in Nevada, Kevin didn't have any money to go defend it. So we sued him in Concord for defamation, and he had to counterclaim. And the only time I ever met Mr. Loeb was when his deposition was being taken in our offices, and I was in the bathroom, and he was standing at the next stall doing his thing. And he said, "Good morning," and I said, "Good morning," and I'm not sure he knew who I was, but I didn't introduce myself.
We need to conclude. Our time is growing short, but do you have any lessons learned from the practice of law?
Well, there's several things that we all learn. One of them is how fast it goes. I mean, I used to, till about 10 years ago, I'd say to people, "We got to get the young lawyers together," and they say, "Do you know any?" So it goes fast. The only thing you've got in currency in this business is your word. If it's not good, the reputation gets around fast that it's not good. If you cut corners, people know you're a lawyer who cuts corners. And if you don't know something, say you don't know something. Lawyers have kind of a genetic inability to say, "I don't know." And it's one of the, I mean, I can't imagine having done anything else. I can't imagine having done it any other place. I certainly couldn't imagine doing it by myself, because the people I've had a chance to work with and the people I had a chance to learn from, and the example they have as quality lawyers, and it wasn't just in Sheehan Finney. I mean, the Jack Middletons and the Kerrigans and the Fred Hall Juniors and the, Frank Kennisons and the people. I mean, this is a great profession with smart people, but it's a special profession in New Hampshire because it's still a lot less cutthroat than in other places. Although, as I said before, everybody when they get to 70 years old thinks the old days were the good old days, and I'm not sure they were. But be honest, say what you don't know, do the best job you can, and let the client know that they're first and you're not first, and you'll be okay.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. This was fun.
It's been a pleasure.